不好意思，让各位久等了。各位下午好，欢迎大家来到长江商学院参加第4届中国宏观经济论坛。我是长江商学院的黄海滨，欢迎各位。
Hi everyone, welcome to CKGSB's 4th China Economic Symposium. I am Irazaka Zhang Yiran from the Global Marketing Team. 2017年
Through the first 3 quarters of 2017, China's economy comfortably surpassed its growth target of around 6.5%, maintaining a steady momentum. But China still faces challenges in improving the quality and efficacy of its economy. As the recent 19th Party Congress addressed, China is in a critical period for transforming its growth model, upgrading the economic structure, and replacing old drivers of growth. Deepening supply-side structural reforms and promoting innovations are the keys to China's future, which will, of course, impact the growth of both Asia-Pacific region and the wider world. President Xi Jinping pointed out clearly in the just concluded 19th Party Congress to deepen the reform by the majestic power. According to the research findings of our CKGSB's professors, reforms play an essential role in explaining China's rise since the reform opening up. But what can we expect of the 19th Party Congress? What types of a reform dividend can we anticipate from China's next moves? And how can China best exploit the new growth drivers? We will try to answer this question for you here. Today, we have invited many world-class professors of CKGSB and renowned economists, entrepreneurs, and media friends. Later, we will make an introduction of these important guests for you.
This event has received great support from FESCO, the China-Britain Business Council, and the British Chamber of Commerce.
那除了刚刚 Ira 介绍到的合作伙伴之
Apart from the partners introduced by Ira, we also received great support from many medias. Now, our media have online broadcasting by Sina Finance, CBN, iPhone, NetEase, and Tencent News for the global broadcasting.
For the audience today, tomorrow marks CKGSB's 15th anniversary. To commemorate this special milestone, we've put together a book on the CKGSB story. To win a copy of this book, we encourage you to share photos and quotes from today's event on your WeChat networks. We also encourage you to scan the WeChat codes on each of your desks to enter the WeChat group that we've created for this event and get to know each other.
那么在这里呢，也要提醒一下各位，因为明天11月22号是我们长江。
We just want to remind you that tomorrow, November the 22nd, is a special day for the CKGSB. That is our 15th anniversary, and we have prepared a very beautiful gift, the CKGSB story. You just open your WeChat and share the moments of today's event, and you are able to have the chance to get this gift.
Distinguished speaker, CKGSB's Assistant Dean Zhou Li. Dean Zhou has been with CKGSB since 2010, overseeing global programs, operations, close to 20 research centers, as well as the CKGSB Knowledge Magazine, which we have outside, and I encourage you to pick a copy of. Dean Zhou will be giving opening remarks about the theme today and also how our school has contributed to it. Please welcome Dean Zhou.
Welcome.
Thank you, Ira. Thank you, Dennis. I believe this is a very honorable moment for myself to make this opening address for you. And firstly, we want to check whether the translation is working. As you may see, we have spent a lot of efforts, and our translation is not machine translated. You may see from today's theme, you may see that the English translation is not a direct translation. They use a lot of efforts in a new era, new perspective, and a new roadmap for your reference. And I find it a very good and a very good opportunity to welcoming you to join us in our 4th China Economic Symposium organized by CKGSB. A big welcome to you all. Of course, I want to extend my extend my congratulations and appreciations to all the participating guests, media friends, and our listeners. Today, we are organizing this symposium, which is highly significant. As we know that the world is undergoing profound changes, the rise of China has become an irreversible trend worldwide, just like President Xi Jinping mentioned ever since he came into the office. He often mentioned that never in the history does China approach to the grand goal of rejuvenation of this country. In the 19th Congress report, he mentioned some key words, and more closer and more confidence and more hopeful to realize the grand goal of rejuvenate this country. So at the CKGSB, and we highly acknowledge the judgment made by President Xi Jinping, and also President Xi Jinping mentioned that the reform is key and critical for China's development. So today we're going to talk about the reform. We feel the pulse of China's economic development to find out the future of China's next move. And such a discussion is highly significant and profound, very important not only to China but also to Asia-Pacific region and the rest of the world. Just like Ira mentioned, tomorrow will be the 15th anniversary for CKGSB, so we organized this symposium to memorizing such an important and significant moment of CKGSB. I have to point out, in the past 15 years, we have maintained our mission and vision. We stick to the principle that we cultivate the leaders and graduates with the innovative and global vision, which is a new generation of business leaders. So, from now on, and the upcoming speakers and their presentations will see our commitment to our original commission, our original mission. And by the end of this weekend, and we will have at Peking University, the Center of Ethics, we co-organize the fifth business forum. That is how to live and sustain and in a more humanity world. And also later we will have an understanding China's next move program with the Hong Kong's Chamber of Commerce, and also Professor Gan Jie, who is going to talk about China's innovation. And you're welcome to join us, not only for today, but also to join us in the upcoming events. And also, I want to extend my congratulations to you. Why? Because you are selected from over 1,000 applicants. It's very lucky, as the probability of getting such a winning chance is very low. So congratulations. And finally, I want to thank you for your participation. Thank all our partners, our guests, and I wish today's symposium a great success. And also, I wish all the listeners and all the participants will find this symposium very fruitful and very productive. Thank you. Thank you, our Assistant Dean, Mr. Zhou Li. Now I'd like to introduce the next speaker, who is the founding dean and professor of China Business and Globalization, CKGSB, and his research of interest includes the reform and management of the Chinese companies and innovative topics. And in terms of Chinese companies' innovation, globalization of Chinese companies, as well as the transformation of China's economy's impact of the world, he is believed to be the authoritative and key opinion leader in this field. And he is a great writer and also has a great influence in this regard. And he proposed a global view standing at the moon and look at the whole world. And he is also research also talked about a different way of thinking. And he prepared the Chinese companies with a very forward-looking and proactive way of thinking. Now, please join me to welcome Professor Xiang Bin to make the next presentation. And he is going to talk about the China's transformation and its global implications. The floor is yours. Thank you very much. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I want to avail myself of this opportunity to thank you for joining us in this symposium among your very busy schedule. So my time is 2 o'clock to 2:20. I only have 4 minutes left. And I want to emphasize that this is my personal view. This is not from the perspective of the CKGSB, Professor Xu Zhengang and Professor Li Wei and Gan Jie, and maybe my views are not in line with theirs. I want to quickly share with you my understandings of these different questions. I hope that my presentation will be a very good beginner for you, and I believe that my colleagues will give you more detailed contents, and mine is only a break for opening such a talk. Today, I want to talk about the global economic transformation, and there are many changes, and such changes are very extensive. It's not about the development model, disruptive technology, or political paradigm, or the social disruption, political disruptions, and the investment and the trade restructure and the governance restructure. There are many other topics following it. There are two things I want to highlight. The first one is the transformation model. Ever since the 1979, the neoliberalization proposed by Madame Thatcher, and a lot of China and the USA were forerunners in the neoliberalization. So China and the USA has the most severe imbalance between the income and the wealth. Let's look at the 2008 Gini index. And this is a statistics from 2008, and Brazil is the top one, and China and the USA is a 0.49, and you may see, according to the Gini coefficient, and China still have the serious imbalance in the wealth and the income. In terms of the welfare, China is still lag behind because we do not have the welfare for the whole nation, and it's not possible to provide a free education and no free pension for all the nation. Therefore, to embrace the neoliberalization, China is one of the forerunners of it. Therefore, China and the US have formed the most severe discrepancy between the rich and the poor. In 2009, I made a small forecast in the past 30 years. From 1979 to 2008, and the 30 years of financial crisis, and is 30 years of turning point in the past 30 years. China and the USA is the forerunners of a neoliberalization, and in the future, we may see more welfares, and the European, and to a large extent, I should say, European countries with very good welfare systems. With China and the USA's competition pressure, so European countries cannot sustain its welfare. So many capitalist factors will be introduced to the European countries. So the global economic structure will see a great and profound changes. Ever since 2008, China's economics new normal, and also Brexit, and the newly selected president of USA may indicate a neoliberalization times. So what does it relevant to the AI? I think the second disruption is caused by the technology. There are so many disruptions by technology. Today, I will narrow down on the AI. A growing number of the experts made varied projections of AI disruption. For example, what percentage of lawyers are not necessary? What percentage of doctors and stock analysts are no longer needed? Auditors, we don't need them. And what does it mean behind so many data? One of the disruptions by the AI means that most of the jobs held by the white collars will be melted away. It's not only about the blue collars, but also the white collars. And in such imbalanced wealth discrepancy, and if such a disruption, just like predicted by most of the experts, I believe by the secondary allocation by the government to address the discrepancy becoming highly urgent and a reality we must face. Therefore, in in May this year with the Columbia University Engineering School and Kennedy School Forum on September the 18th. And one of the forecasts I said that the socialism will have a strong comeback. This is the forecast made by us because of the disruption made by the artificial intelligence. I don't think that the capitalist mechanism will be good enough to address such a challenge, but I believe it's time for the socialism comeback. AI really saves socialism, and this is a factor we have to face. When we put them together, it is true that we face times of so many disruptions. The other questions we must say, that's some global economic problems, and with China's answers. China is already the second largest economy worldwide. Ever since the time we expanding our economy, we really focus on the global resources integration. We call it global economic responsibility. China and its entrepreneurs to be accepted and respected by the whole world. In addressing some key issues of the world, we must make our due contributions, and maybe we will have some we may have some economists like Adam Smith's contribution or penicillin's invention, not only to address our own problems of progress, but also make contribution to the global progress, especially to address some key challenges facing the whole world. According to the 19th Congress report, that is the solution to make China's solution, to provide China's solution to some major problems of the world. And at least there are two ideas I fully acknowledge. As I mentioned that in the in Moscow, I do see that they have a different way of living. In China, we prefer the speed, but in Russia, they prefer a slow speed, and they have a lot of spiritual aspiration. But China, we are very earthly and really informed of the snacks and the food. And you may see the commercial environment of China, especially in subways. In Russia subway, there are so many space, but there is no advertisement. There's a great discrepancy between China and Russia. That's why I mentioned that why Russia can make a great contribution in the recent arts and history with such a beautiful ballet dancers, and also to drive the orbit of the synchronize the satellite to the Earth. Maybe in the socialist development of China, we need to emphasize or highlight the differentiated lifestyle. This is the prerequisite for the talents and also a first step for the talents. So I see the greatness of harmony, but not identical. And according to my observation in Japan, there is a restaurant 260 years long, and the ninth generation owner of the restaurant. So 260 years of history and a persistence of sticking to the excellency and refined way of cooking to become one of the top Japanese restaurants. If such a restaurant to be opened in Beijing and Shanghai or other tier 1 cities, and a lot of PEVC go there to ask you to run your chain store, and to make you as the one of the wealthiest people in the world. Japan is a classical representation of a harmonious society, so it is not only about institutional design, but I think that everyone pursues his own dream. This is the prerequisite for a harmonious society. Everyone has his own dream. Even though there are so many changes of the world, the next generations of this Japanese family want to cook the best in Japan. And Japan, one of the most harmonious society in the world, really stick to the principle of harmony, but not identical. And I believe that harmonious society really emphasizes on the differentiated dreams. This is what I learned from Japan. In USA, and there are so many innovations in USA, no other countries can catch up with it. So it's not about the GDP, it is also the incremental GDP growth number one, not only PEVC Silicon Valley. Equally important among so many wonderful graduates of the American universities, and some of them just show great interest in the black hole, so they can really study and have some research in the past 10 or 20 years. They can give birth to Zuckerberg or the Gates, but we do see a group of students who can keep sober and also to really driven by their curiosities in their research. Therefore, it's not that my colleagues or fellow students become rich people, but I also need to follow them. No, they can still follow their interest of research. Their motivation is not to become rich. They still stick to their own original dream. They are highly persistent. Therefore, the persistence in the excellency, the original power of the innovation really originates from the dream of harmony, but not identical. So innovation, integration, I believe the mass production and the mass startup. I believe many young people want to earn their wealth, and I do hope more young Chinese nations want to shoulder up responsibility of China, of the world, to run their business, to make their startup, so that you can enjoy a brighter future, so that your mass innovation and mass startup can address most of the problems. So this is the principle of harmony, but not identical. I believe this is the principle learned by many by the Chinese history, and also it is one of the real sense. The other ideas we love is the combination of the destiny and the humanity. And also, we believe that man is measured all things, and we give too much priority to men's.
And this concept of the human being as an integrated part of the nature can make great contributions to the development of the future. And man as an integrated part of the nature and also learn from the nature is also an old part of our ancient history. I'm very positive, and although there were a lot of challenges, and there were a lot of summarized and things that we can learn from the 90s Party Congress, and there were so many other opportunities. And for example, and we do have a lot of opportunities brought by the disruptive technologies, including the transit of the conventional industry, and also the upgrading of the industrial chain, and then also it includes the development of the conventional technology and the new round of urbanization, especially the new feature town, and then also one of the very important is the new liberalism, and for the other countries, especially the states, that is basically reached to the end. However, there were about 30 industries that can realize the very fast development through deregulation, and so we do not really develop for the sake of the growth. We have a different approach. So this is very different because we can find so many different sources of development, and including the upgrading of the consumption and upgrading of the spending, and also the second round of the demographic dividends, and compare with the Russian, compare with the other countries, and there was still great space for China to realize the further space. And compare with the Russian, and we believe that our GDP per capita is quite matching, and of course for these issues, and that cannot be solved only by government alone. And for example, the public health care, and then the expenditures on the health care is not only about 9% of the GDP. So there were so many space and opportunities, and also under the initiation of the Belt and Road, and China enterprises can realize that the further integrated global resources. So there were so many economic drivers to make you optimistic, and there were so many new drivers that can make you feel very optimistic for the future development of the China economy. So there were still, although there were some challenges, but we need to keep optimistic. And this is just my personal view, and I really want to make my keynotes a very good start for the further discussions. Thank you very much. Thank you so much.
Is Gan Jie, Associate Dean for Technology, Innovation, and Entrepreneurship, Professor of Finance, and Director of the Center on Finance and Economic Growth at CKGSB. I think Professor Gan Jie really embodies CKGSB's strengths. She received her PhD from MIT, was a tenured professor at HKUST, and also taught at Columbia Business School. Interested in accurately analyzing the Chinese industrial economy with both accurate and timely data, Professor Gan launched China's first large-scale industrial survey back in 2014, Today, Professor Ganjie will reveal whether China's economy is stabilizing and where reform may be most needed, while she draws on her latest quarterly survey results. Please welcome Professor Ganjie.
好，谢谢Ira，谢谢大家。
Thank you very much, Ira, for your introduction. Thank you very much for all the audience to participate in our today's event. And so we just listen to things and openings on the transformation of China's economy in all different kind of sectors, but my speech may focus on the industrial economy. I think this is actually a very familiar report for you. We've been have this research for more than 3 years, and actually 3.5 years. And within these 3.5 years, we've witnessed a lot of the changes that happen to the economy, China's economy. And one of the best change is the weather condition, and then pollution that has been improved in Beijing. And however, on the other side, in our industrial economies was actually not seeing a very positive change. And although our today's air quality is not really good, but we can actually learn a lot of good news from our today's report. And we issue this report because we want to have a better understanding on China's economy. And China's economy is a very, very wide topics, especially for the industrial economy, because it is a big country and there were so many different kind of sectors in industry, and we do not really have a very good index to represent the overdevelopment of the industrial economy. And many in the index are not really forward-looking, and they are more focused on the month-on-month or year-on-year changes. And also for my survey, I want to further review why economic is good. We want to understand the underneath mechanisms of economic development. And within my report, you are going to find a lot of specific descriptions on the index, and you can find the bilingual versions online. And for our samples, we basically obtain our samples in 2008 when we just started our survey, and we also added the data and databases dated back in 2013. And then agriculture, we conduct telephone interviews on 20,000 Chinese enterprises. Well, actually, sorry, it is about 10,000 enterprises, and our recovery rate is about over 2,000, and our sample representativeness is very positive. And in this 3 years, and we realized that this kind of survey is very necessary for us to have a better understanding on China's industrial economy, because there were a lot of conclusions that may not necessarily be very accurate. For example, the over expectations in GDP development, and we also much focus on the shrinking of the private investment. And also we want to have a better understanding on why the industrial economies has not been performed very well, and whether it is caused by the financing problems or is impacted by the exports. So now I would like to talk about the major findings of this quarters. So although the business sentiment index is still shrinking, and however the industrial economy has shown a sign of the recovery, and also the costs continue to rise significantly. The overcapacity is still a huge challenge in terms of both the prevalence and also the magnitude. It's still at its historical height. And also for this culture, we find that the enterprises are concerned about environmental issues that have been significantly increased. That is related to the last 4 rounds of the environmental inspection. And the structures of our ownership 84% is state-owned, and 9% are the foreign or JV, and it's much in line with the ownership of our overall economy. So let's look at the business sentiment index of the overall industrial economy, and we've included the industrial diffusion index, and another one is expected operations diffusion index, and another one it is whether it is good time for the investment. And so basically we've used this index and diffusion index to describe our results. This is actually 3-for-1 option, and you need to choose whether this culture is increasing or decreasing, or is flat. So if you are increasing, it's like you given a very good remark for your this quarter's performance. If it is decreasing, then it's like you given yourself a 0 score, and if it is neutral, and you given yourself a 50. And so we are using the score of 50 as a turning point. So 50 is a very important point, and the average score is actually represented in this purple line on the pink line, and we used this one to represent the business sentiment index, and as you can see from here, is the meaning under the 50s, so it is overly shrinking. And there were a lot of diversities. The biggest one is on the investments. So the investment performance has been sluggish for quite a while. And for our economy, industrial economy, we are still seeing a very good recovery. We are seeing a quite good recovery for the investment. And this bars represents our question whether you think it is a good time for the investment. And for this right line, that represents the actual investment proportion. For example, in quarter 3, 10% of the enterprises conducted the fixed asset, fixed investment. And I also asked why you conduct the fixed investment, why it is just for the maintenance to maintain your current portfolio. Oh, it is for the expansionary investment. In the past several quarters, only 1-2% enterprises conduct this kind of an expansionary investment. And however, the proportion of the firms with the expansionary investments increased significantly from 1% in the previous quarters to 4% in the quarter 4. So this is we believe that we are seeing a very good recovery sign, and also the operational rate has also been increased, and the capacity utilizations increased from 44% in the previous quarters to 47% in quarter 4. And also we are seeing the increase of the gross margin. The gross margin has been quite low in the previous several quarters, and however in the quarter 4 about over 15%, an increase from the 28% in the quarter 2 to 31% in this quarter. So that is the second reason for me to believe that we are seeing a very good capital utilization and the gross margin, and also we are seeing the slight expansions of the production, especially for private sector. In the past several quarters, although generally speaking, the production are showing an increasing trend, and however, reading from the numbers and the statistics, and the private productions for the most times was maintained below the 50, and the production was mainly driven by the public SOEs, and this diffusions index actually represent the size, and however we need to see the changes of this index to see how the production changed. And for the last sector, the overall productions are expanded slightly, and also the private firm stopped shrinking from the first time since the quarter 4 in 2016. So let's look at another index, and we are also checking the production and also as well the stocks, and the basics. Basically, most of the index are maintained at the 50%, have the 50, and another one is the cost and the price. In the past several quarters, the industrial products and the price has shown an information trend since the quarter 4 of the last year. And this inflation is caused by cost. We just check the increase of the product price, which has already surpassed the 50%. The 50% of the enterprises showing that their product price has been increased. We also compare that with the overall sample. And they are also showing a very obviously increase on their cost. And 1/3 of the enterprises seeing over 10% increase on the cost. And also, we are checking the proportions of the enterprises which seeing a huge price or a very obvious increase of their price. And let's look at the top 5 and the bottom 5 industries with the best performance, and we are seeing a very huge diversity. And the pros one is actually 26. And the best performance reached to the score of almost 70. So there is a huge diversity. And for the good performance in the industries, and we are seeing a very good persistency. And we are seeing a very good performance among the health productions and supplies and production supply and the water supply. And also for this culture, we are seeing that the medical and as well as the food and the beverage industry. And for the worst performance one, and that includes the metal ores, the non-metallic, the mineral products, and also the leather-related products. And for those industries, we are seeing this ranked as the bottom to several industries since we conducted this survey. Now let's look at one of most heated discussed it in the industry, and a lot of the media believe that the economic development of China was driven by the real estate industry. If we read the number of the real estate, we are seeing that actually it do not really have a very strong driving effect. So here I've listed several industries related to the real estate, including the cement and the construction materials as well as the coal. And we compare this with the total sampling, which is in the right bar. If we compared those real estate related industry with the overall sampling, we are seeing the general overall sentiment index. We are not seeing the very obvious good performance of this. Now we believe that since the price, although the price is very high and the cost is higher than the overall sampling, and however, and its production is not as good as the overall sampling. And we are also want to observe that there were some overcapacity situations. However, for the coal industry, this kind of overcapacity is not that obvious. So in terms of the statistics, my personal opinion is the real estate and the related industry and only having a very small proportion of the overall economic is only about 8%. And also it do not really overperform the overall economy. And let's see some regions in performance. And so I'm showing the top 5 region development and the bottom 5 regional development. And we are only seeing the top 3 regions and higher than the break-even point. And we've seen a very good performance of the Guizhou province, and yes, it is on the top 5. And for the bottom 5, beside Beijing, is mainly located in the east and west regions. And the east and west regions didn't have a very good performance compared with the overall economy of China. And one of the most interesting part of my service is to review the internal mechanisms of economic development. So in order to understand this question, we directly ask enterprises, and we ask them what is the biggest limitations for your national cultures and production. And in the past several cultures, one of the biggest limitations is the lack of orders. Well, this is actually a multi-option question. They can choose the different options. And the lack of an order is one of the most limitations for the Chinese enterprises. So that means overcapacity, and also there will the increase of the cost, causing the limitation of their development and operation. And then at the early stage of our service, many enterprises believe that the increase in cost is one of the limitations. And then in these quarters, and we find that the last 4 rounds of environment inspections have a great impact on the enterprises. Many enterprises believe that the environmental issues become one of the limitations, and 40% of enterprises believe that is the bottlenecks and its a limitation. And the biggest challenges is still the overcapacity. And I'm showing several bars of the past several quarters, and that shows the proportions of the enterprises with the answer of the supply over demands and demands over supply. And in the past several quarters, 2/3 of enterprises believe that is a demand over the supply. And we also see in the diffusion index of the domestic supply over demands in the past several months, the supply and demand space is about 80% to 82% to 83%. And also we are seeing this supply demand conflicts greater than the international stage. It is about 10% higher in terms of overcapacity index. And also for a certain industry or a certain region, if the overcapacity index is over 10%, and we believe that it is an enterprise or a sector or a region of very severe overcapacity issues. So now I'm showing enterprises with an overcapacity index over 10 to 20%. And also you can see in the past 2 quarters, we are seeing the most severe conditions in terms of overcapacity. Although we are seeing a lot of decapacity, but we are still having overcapacity issues. And for a certain industry, if more than 20% of the enterprises are seeing that their overcapacity index is over 10%, then that we believe that this is an industry seeing the severe overcapacity issues. And I'm using the same method to define the regions or the provinces of the severe overcapacity issues. So as I just described in terms of the amplifications and the prevalence of overcapacity is at a historic high.
The second challenge is the rising cost as voted in the surveys. If you check the statistics, the rising cost has been a long-term challenge. And according to the recent data, we find out the cost rising started from Q4 last year. The cost rising index grew from 50 to 70. As highlighted by the red, which is the unit cost rise, and this is the labor cost rise. The dotted line is the raw material cost. So the 3 types of cost all go up. Ever since Q4 last year, we do see a dramatic rise of the costs, and this year we see another round of growth of the cost. Up to now, I have talked about the industrial economy. I want to discuss the policy now. Let's look at the data instead of intuition or some small-scale interviews. What kind of policy discussions we may have? Firstly, is the monetary policy. Oversupply means that no investment opportunities. You may see the sluggish investment of the companies. Every quarter, only 3 to 5% of the companies believe that financing is a big problem, which means that we have very relaxed monetary policy cannot truly rejuvenate the industrial economy. If we look at the monetary policy in the past several quarters, ever since Q1 of 2016 to now, the balance of credit increased by 20 trillion RMB from 100 billion, and we do see a 20% growth rate. Therefore, the monetary policy is very relaxing. How about the financing bottleneck? It is indicated and explained within the report. I will not go into the details. The other thing is the adequacy of the fund. Seldom do we see companies say that they are in short of funds. And let's see that there is a small percentage of companies with new loans, and it is fit into the trend of the companies with capital investment. Without newly added loans, I must ask the companies why there is no newly added loans. 100% up to 99% of the companies indicated by Q3 think that there is no demand or need for capital, as there is no need for investment, and also they have so much loan from the banks. Therefore, all the data show that the very relaxing monetary policies made the financing not a big problem. Therefore, such a loose monetary policy cannot rejuvenate industrial economy. And let's look at the difference between the public and the private sector. Let's look at the performance. The bar indicates the performance. And the red one, the solid color is public sector or state owned by the government, and the dotted color is owned privately. You may see that the difference between the public and the private companies. Now I want to talk about the capacity of the state-owned companies is better than the private sector. If we look at the expansionary fixed investment percentage, and this is the proportion of the public investment in expansionary fixed fields highlighted by the solid color. The other one is private, and in most cases, private companies lag behind the public companies. Let's look at the volume variation of exportation. There are some argument that the production variation are export-driven. You may see that the export variation in the several quarters are mainly driven by the public companies or the state-owned companies. They are not so much driven by the private companies. The third part is about supply-side reform. As you may see from the data, superficially, we witness the oversupply and the ongoing cost, and the industrial economy faces challenges of contraction, and it is critical to upgrade industry. In my view, that's a growing number of the manufacturing companies in China do not have their core competitiveness. In our every year survey, we asked them their R&D expenditure. We will not add that question quarterly because there is no much variation across quarters. From Q4 2016, we found out 80% of the Chinese companies have no investment in R&D at all. And those with R&D investment, most of them, you may see the R&D is less than 5% of their revenue. And this is about the R&D investment ever since 2014, 2015, 2016. We do see a decline trend of R&D expenditure, and a growing number of companies have zero investment in R&D. So the companies are not so good in this field with a very low margin. They cannot spare much money on R&D to upgrade their industry. Now I want to give you statistics of the listed company as their data is available on the website. And if we make a comparison between them and the BAT, there are over 1,500 manufacturing listed company, public traded company. In terms of the profitability, the manufacturing companies in comparison to BAT, the three company BAT, its profitability is close to one quarter of the 1,500 companies. The same ratio in USA is only 1/15. And as a matter of fact, let's look at the capitalization, the value, the market value. The BAT stock performs quite good, and in June, at the end of June, let's look at the profitability. BAT is close to half of the market capitalization of the 1,500 public traded companies. Therefore, manufacturing companies in comparison to BAT has shown a sign of contraction. I think that BAT cannot fully support the real economy, and the real economy or industrial economy is very necessary. And after 3 years follow-up research or survey, we do see the end of the first stage, and 600 million people move out of poverty, and the world economy size ranks #2 in the world. And after several quarters decapacity efforts, we're still in surplus of capacity at a very high historical level. The first stage of the industrialization is characterized by concentrating the low-cost labor and low-cost resources. In the future, the solution is the innovation by companies and by their own R&D to form their own core competitiveness. In the 19th Party's Congress report, there are many visionary directions are proposed by the report, such as building up an innovative country. We need to form a group of strategic talents with business leaders and young generation of a high-tech background. These are very visionary strategies. At CKGSB, I want to make this introduced to you. We have made a lot of trials and efforts in the technical innovation. One of them is the cross-disciplinary subjects. Only by combining the engineering technological education with the business education, we can truly cultivate the new business leaders in the high-tech fields. First of all, such a program is not MBA, and we have our partners. And Professor Li Dejiang from Hong Kong University of Science and Technology, Song Sanhu Robert Foundation is one of our partners. Such a program is open to those who have 3 years experience. 3 years experience engineers with a startup owners, and also the part-time learning program is available, and we highlight the intelligent, smart manufacturing and products. With the innovation in such fields, we can cultivate a new generation of entrepreneurs and startup company owners. So our slogan is learning by doing, and from a concept to a prototype development and market testing. After such a cycle, we can make this setup as a potential company, and we try to match them with the manufacturing companies to develop high-tech products and to offer them various kind of resources. By this program education, the students bring in the ideas or the innovative products into the program. So every course is developed or built on ideas and think about how to produce product. Is it possible to refine their original innovative ideas or startup ideas? So this is a good combination of education and startup, and this is one of our trials in the technological innovation. Thank you.
I think we had a fantastic overview into China's industrial economy, and then looking at overcapacity, whether financing is a bottleneck, and down to the type of talent that it requires in the industry now. Next, we'll have a dialogue between Professor Gan Jie and Tom Orlik, Bloomberg's chief Asia economist. A quick introduction on Tom. At Bloomberg, Tom is responsible for analyzing Asia macroeconomic data and policies, with a special focus on China and how these impact global markets. Before joining Bloomberg, Tom was chief China correspondent for economics at Wall Street Journal. And prior to coming to China, Tom served as advisor to the UK executive director of IMF and also as a policy analyst at the British Treasury. Tom is also author of Understanding China's Economic Indicators. Now in this dialogue, Tom and Professor Ganjie will look at China's current economic cycle and policy implications, as well as the importance of reliable data. Please welcome Professor Ganjie and Tom Orlik.
So, Professor Gan, first of all, let me say that was just a marvelous presentation.
Thank you.
So rich in data and original data from your own surveys as well. I certainly learned a lot. I'm sure everybody in the audience learned a lot as well. I guess my initial observation is that we seem to be, in terms of the data, at a quite exciting moment for China's economy. Historically, we've relied on the National Bureau of Statistics and the People's Bank of China to tell us what's going on. Clearly, those numbers remain incredibly important and remain the basis of understanding what's going on in China's economy. At the same time, we've had this flourishing of new ways of thinking about what's going on in China. Your industrial survey, Professor Li Wei, who we'll be speaking with later with his survey of entrepreneurs, big data from companies like Baidu and Alibaba and Zhaopin, which is providing us with unique insights. Tell me a little bit about your view on how we should make sense of the official data, the new academic data, the big data coming out. Should we be looking at all of it? Should we be paying a particular attention to a certain section of it? What's your view?
Okay. That's a very good question. By the way, I read your book about the Chinese economic indicators, and I was really impressed when I was starting to work on Chinese issues, and I was very impressed a foreign economist was able to really dig everything out more thoroughly than a lot of Chinese economists. So congratulations on that. And obviously, you know, there are a lot of data sources, and I think the Chinese data has received a lot of criticism. For that, I think my view are, I have two perspectives. First, I think any data is useful. It really depends on how you use it. Our GDP data, oftentimes there's a lot of suspicion about to what extent it's really reflecting the economy. But I felt, yes, there might be some systematic bias. But if you look at the changes and if you look at the trend, you still can see a lot. So that's how I encourage people to use the data, even if the quality may not be very good. But on the other hand, I think to fully understand the Chinese economy, we do need more data. And that's actually motivating my survey precisely. When I first looked at the Chinese data, I felt, well, the most timely data is GDP in the industrial sector, which I was very interested in. It's mainly PMI. But PMI is just one index, pretty much, and it tells you the change from last quarter. But we do not understand what about different industries, different size of firms, and different types of firms, and also what about regional variation. So we need an overall picture. And also, we need something that's more forward-looking. That's why I'm bringing investments. So I think there are a lot of data, and to use data, you have to analyze it wisely. If eventually you find that there's no data, it's better to explore new data. So I think the big data, I'm not exactly sure how it's going to turn out, but I think there's great potential. If we can have a mechanism to really collect data properly and then to analyze it properly.
Thanks very much. Well, thank you for your recommendation for my book. When I wrote it, I was hoping I would get some recommendations from economists, and I did. But I was surprised to find I also got recommendations from some doctors. Doctors found that if they had patients who had trouble sleeping, they could recommend reading a few pages from my book in the evening, and then they just fell asleep immediately. It's remarkably effective. Let's move on to talking about some of the key findings from your data. And I should also say that at Bloomberg, one of the things we're trying to do is make sure we have all of the market and economic data which is necessary for understanding China's economy on the Bloomberg terminal. That includes Professor Gan's survey data. We don't quite have the Q3 numbers yet because they just came out, but this chart shows us data up to Q2. And I think it shows one of the key relationships which becomes clear from looking at your survey, which is the relationship between overcapacity and companies' lack of interest in investing.
Right.
So as we can see in the chart, overcapacity, oversupply in the domestic market, very severe. Very few firms believe it's a good time to invest. Now, listening to your survey, I had a little bit of a sense that the situation in the third quarter has improved.
Yeah.
What's your sense? Are we talking about a marginal improvement, but the structural situation remains very challenging? Or do you think that we're now at the beginning of a more positive trajectory?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's something that I was thinking about when I look at the data. I think we probably need more data next quarter and maybe even next 2 quarters to data to make a conclusive argument. Both are possible. The first possibility is, given that the overcapacity is still at historical high, then this could just be a marginal improvement. But there is hope, given that if you look at the production, it has been overall on an upper trend, and probably mostly driven by state-owned firms, but at least the private firms right now are stopped shrinking their production. So there could be, at the margin, some new investment opportunities that firms are pursuing, and that could turn out to be a quite substantial outcome eventually. Yeah.
So let me share another chart, which is one of the ones which we use in our analysis. It's a calculation based on the National Bureau of Statistics data. And what we've done is we've looked at infrastructure spending as a percentage of fixed asset investment. And what you can see is that infrastructure spending as a percentage of fixed asset investment now is higher than it was during the Great Financial Crisis, if we go back to 2009, 2010. And to me, that tells a story about what's driving the firming in conditions or the strengthening that we're seeing in the official data and in your numbers in the third quarter. And it raises a question about the sustainability of this recovery.
Right.
Yes, growth has recovered. Clearly, a lot of that recovery has come from quasi-fiscal spending, local government financing vehicles, public-private partnerships. A lot of it has been channeled into infrastructure spending. The question I have is, has China primed the pump? Have they done enough stimulus to kick off a kind of self-sustaining recovery, to get some momentum going in the private sector? Or, if they want to carry on hitting 6.5% growth targets, do China's policymakers have to continue pumping with the quasi-fiscal stimulus and the infrastructure spending?
Right.
What's your perspective?
Yeah, I totally agree with your observation. That's what's coming out of the data. Despite the overall, the country's investment level, high investment level, the private investment in the industrial sector has been very, very low. And this increase in infrastructure investment is coupled with an expansionary monetary policy. They are hand by hand. And from the first time when I releasing the report, I was already finding financing is not a main constraint for the industrial firm. So it's not going to help the industrial firm, but it's probably going to buy time. And 2 to 3 years has passed. So have we really bought enough time? That's basically the question. I think we did buy some time in the sense that I think the service industry is going up quite a bit. BAT is doing very well. And there are some new technologies, AI and robotics and so on. These subsectors are indeed doing very well. And these sectors also has helped to some extent the expansion of production for cell phone makers, for example. So I think overall there has been growth in certain subsectors of the industrial sector. Going forward, are we going to completely go out of this this kind of dynamic, or it's going to stay here? I think that's really the risk that the Chinese economy is facing. Have we really bought enough time? And my sense is that probably not exactly enough. So curtailment of overcapacity and associated pain would be lasting for a bit longer. And meanwhile, we really hope the new industry, the technology innovation can catch up. That's precisely why we are setting up this program right now, to hopefully to help or to facilitate this process.
Right, absolutely. So one of the things which we see traveling around the country is that some of the policies which look extremely important and positive, like cutting excess capacity or improving the quality of the environment, are being implemented in a way that perhaps has unintended and negative consequences. So we were in Henan recently, and we met with an aluminum producer, and we asked them, are you facing problems with the cuts in capacity in the aluminum sector? And they said, no, it doesn't matter because we're a state-owned firm and we have the production permits. And we were in Wenzhou, and we met a lot of the Wenzhou entrepreneurs, and the first complaint that they had was about environmental controls and how environmental controls were being imposed in a way which they felt was disadvantageous, was negative for the private sector.
Okay.
One of the points I see coming through in your data is that the state sector is doing better, and the private sector is doing worse. I also saw that striking finding on, I think, 14% of firms saying that environmental problems were a big concern. How worried should we be that the recovery and growth has come at the expense of a dynamic private sector? And Cheung Kong can train a new generation of entrepreneurs, but there just won't be the opportunities for them as the state sector advances.
Right, right. I would say curtailment of overcapacity is hurting actually both the state-owned firm and the private firms. If you look at the data, so there are state firms also has some dip, quite substantial dip along the way. So I think the government is targeting the state-owned firms to make sure, for example, it set a target to reduce the steel production by X percentage and also the coal production by X percentage. I think at those times, that's 2015 and 16, state firms were the main target. But the survivals, of course, would do very well because they get the permit. Yeah, so I think one of the reason or the data seem to be telling us the expansion of production seem to be at the expense of firms that has been shut down. And once it's shut down, profit margin will become better, pricing power is slightly better, and everyone's doing a bit better. But the problem is there might be more new entrants, and also I think the key problem is the firms do not or have not developed some core competitive advantage in terms of technology. That's why it's very easy to enter into a sector when there's a profitable opportunities. and later the opportunity would disappear, and everyone is facing overcapacity. So I do see that kind of dynamic. That dynamics is hurting both state firm and the private firms. But overall, on leverage, state firms is getting some advantages. So that's why they are doing better. It's not necessarily you kill the private firms so that state firm is doing better. I don't think that's what's going on.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's not Gorjin Min Tui, it's Go Tui Min Ye Tui.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right.
So, what's the solution to that problem? I mean, how it's easy to, of course we want firms with core competitive advantages. Of course, we want firms to do more R&D. How do we get from where we are now to where we need to be? What's the policies that we need to have in place?
Yeah, that's easy said than to be done, certainly. I do think the government can provide or play an important role in, because obviously the data shows the vast majority, close to 3/4 of the firms, are having profit gross margin below 15%. Whereas Western firms like Intel, Microsoft, if you look at the data, they spend 15% of their sales on R&D. So how do you catch up? And given the low profit margin, indeed, it's very difficult for the firm to put up the money for R&D. What I think that's going to evolve is, on the one hand, the firms that's not capable of coming up with the money or the ability to develop new technology or core competence will eventually just be let go. And then hopefully it's at the margin there are new firms being created and funded by private capital as well as state capital. The government is having a lot of what's called 国家引导基金, and this has to be matched by private funds and to be used to invest in the technology sector. So I think the new firms or firms with R&D capacity hopefully can be funded by this capital and then to develop core competence that's needed for long-term sustainability.
We have to talk about deleveraging. One of the key subjects, Xi Jinping raised it at the Financial Work Conference over the summer. Just last week, we had the PBOC rolling out some important new regulations for controlling the shadow banking sector. So one of the phrases which we've heard for many years in China is 融资难融资贵, right? Based on your survey, it seems that it's not 融资难融资贵. It's like 融资便宜但是我不要, right? The finance is there, but the firms don't want it. What does that mean for the deleveraging agenda?
Okay.
Does it mean the PBOC could proceed more aggressively with monetary tightening?
Yeah. One of the most surprising results from this survey and the recurring is the fact that 融资 or financing is not the bottleneck. And this is specifically for the industrial sector. So that means whatever deleveraging, and we ask about to what extent you have sufficient capital, you're leveraging, and so on. So this policy is not going to affect the industrial sector that much, just like it's not going to boost the industrial sector in the beginning. But deleveraging would affect, mainly is targeting state government financing. And that can trigger systematic risk. So to me, deleveraging is about that sector. And also it may affect state-owned firms quite a bit. And the third types of firms, sector that's going to be affected will be the real estate sector. If you look at the publicly traded real estate companies, their leverage ratio is totally scary. Even if their price has gone up by 3-fold, 5-fold this year. Yeah. So these three sectors would be mostly affected.
And I think we've got time to hit one last topic. So let's throw it forwards and let me ask you a difficult question. Looking into 2018, the government says that deleveraging is a priority. At the same time, you mentioned the potential for stresses on local government financing, on state-owned enterprises, on the real estate sector. Where do you see the biggest risk factor in 2018? Where do you think that the biggest stresses could appear? And if we do see deleveraging causing significant real economy stress, what's your bet? Do you think the government is going to progress the deleveraging agenda, even though maybe they face growth falling below 6%, 5%, 4%? Or do you think the growth target stays as the biggest priority, and if growth falls, deleveraging can wait?
Right. My sense is that I try not to predict things, but I try to say what are the important factors to be considered. And so let me go that kind of sort of reasoning. I think the most important factor is stability. So if systematic risk is indeed triggered, then we can always stop it and then see and wait and see what's next. So stability is certainly important. And of course, deleveraging, if it's triggering default and so on, these sectors will be affected. And I think next year, to me, in the industrial sector, overcapacity or curtailment or supply side reform still would be a main focus, and there will be some pain, but controlled. That's my sense. And real estate sector is something that I'm not exactly sure. There might be some pain being seen, but I don't think it's going to trigger a widespread systematic default. And the government and the state-owned firms, I think from the data, you see that private firms are, which is the vast majority of the firms, are not really doing well. So some deepening of state-owned enterprises, because we don't know if state-owned firms are truly more efficient than the private firms, but they are doing well. So there might be some inefficiency there. So deepening of state-owned enterprise, reform of state-owned enterprise could be an important theme as well.
So I think I share your caution about expressing a firm view on real estate. One of the things which makes me doubt my skills as an economist, I moved to Shanghai 10 years ago, and my mother-in-law, who's from Ningbo, said, "You should really invest in Shanghai property. It can only go up." And I said, "Oh, don't be silly. You don't understand markets. There's huge oversupply. We have to stay out." 10 years on, if I'd listened to my mother-in-law, I'd have made a lot of money. It's very hard to see into the future. No one knows what's going to happen next week, let alone next year. But one thing I can say with a lot of clarity is no matter what happens, we're going to understand it in a more timely way and in a more granular way by looking at Professor Gan's data. So Professor Gan, thank you very much for sharing your time and your thoughts with us.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tom Olick and Professor Gan, for your wonderful conversation. And now I would like to introduce our next very important keynote speaker, Professor Li Wei. Professor Li Wei is the professor of economics, director of the Case Center, and director of the China Economy and Sustainable Development Center at the CKGSB. And he formerly served as a professor at the Darden Graduate School of the Business University of Virginia. And Professor Li's research has been published in journals of the political economy. And let's welcome Professor Li Wei. It is first time and for me to stage with the background music. Thank you very much for being here. I'm going to use the Mandarin, and however, I'm going to use English for the dialogue. And today, I want to use some of our own statistics to share my insights on the alternative looks at China's growth cycle. And here, mainly, I want to talk about some outlooks of the supply side reform. And for the supply side reform, that is quite related to our economic reforms, and I would like to share my insight with you. And I also want to have a very good dialogue and discussion later after this presentation. And let's start with some short-term statistics. And let's focus on the structural issues. And then after that, and I'm going to talk about some solutions and what should we do next. Do we need to do something on the supply side or demand side? And I'm also going to do an historic review. And back to the Qing dynasty, which was the silver standard system, and I also want to make some comparison with Japan. Why is that? Because I believe that Japan is a very good case for us to learn, although it is a negative case. And however, after 20 years of deflation and inflation, and nowadays the economy is quite stabilized and with a lower cost. So I want to know what we can learn from Japan. So let's start with the statistics. And we are seeing the stabilized economic development, and we estimated that given there is no big adjustment of economic and policy, we are going to finish the economic target of the GDP growth rate of 6.5 to 7%. And this index is comprised with the 4 sub-index. We have the sales and profits, the outlook index. Another very important one is the inventory index, as well as the financing environment. And this index actually comes from the EMBA studies of the CKGSB. And we mainly sampled those data from the small and the mid-sized enterprises and then the private sector. So in terms of financing, although we can now say there were a lot of bias, but actually, compared with SOEs and big enterprises, they did have a very different financing environment. And you can read this also from this data. And then we summarize this full sub-net index, and we believe that development momentum is quite good.
Highlight the structure. If we look at the cost side, and we may find out that at the beginning, from the data acquisition to now, the cost is growing up quickly. And it is made by the diffusion index. If it is around 90, it means that the percentage of the cost rising deducted by the lowering cost companies divided by 2, it is 0.9. This is a big data, which means that most of the companies are facing rising costs. Therefore, there is a very fast growing of the cost for most of the companies. It's not only the labor cost on the rise, such as the wage, salary, welfare, the overall cost is on the rise. And also, you may see the cost recently up from lower level to a higher level. And if we look at the slide, we may ask this question. Okay, you have rising cost. do our companies in China can transfer such a cost to the downstream companies or downstream consumers? If we put these two slides together, we want to answer this question. Our companies in China find it difficult to transfer increasing costs to the consumers, let alone the downstream companies. Because in most cases, the products sold to the downstream companies are lower in their price. But we know in recent months, thanks to the discussion we heard, and we do see the progress of capacity, and which really help to manage the increasing cost. We do see a improvement on that. If we put these data together, you may feel that the margin of the companies are squeezed. And after squeezing the margin, you may imagine in the past, it's easy to return the money after borrowing money. You have the capability of paying back, but now your capability of paying back is weakened. Therefore, we find out another problem of leveraging becoming very serious. You can't decapacity. Why? Because the Chinese companies dare not lower the price for selling them. The stock cannot be moved out by sales, as our costs are going up quickly. We feel that we have a three deduction, and one makeup. I think that the cost reduction is the core in our discussion. Let's look at the companies of CKGSB, which are different from other companies. For example, there is a high investment in infrastructure. You know that the companies, the students or the graduates working for the companies are quite different. And these companies are still making recruitment and make a lot of investment, because these companies find it time to make shift or make transformation, because the traditional industry, legacy industry are not good enough. And we do believe that CKGSB's graduates are full of passionate and aggressive, looking for something better. They are the mainstay of China's economy. Therefore, the companies where our graduates work are very strong in the competitiveness. And most of the conflicts fall into the supplier side. And the one of the issue is the lowering the cost. For example, the margin of the companies and the leverage is becoming a big problem. And also, very fast growing up of the cost, and there is a lower capability of lower the of the price, and therefore the cost is critical. And the good quality companies still have a great motivations. And on one hand, we have a structural problem. On the other hand, the companies have a motivation for strong expansion. And how to make up for it? On one hand, and our over investment in supplier side, and the margin efficiency for the credit expansion is not high enough. If we look at it, and this is a newly added loan and highlighted by the blue, and also the newly added GDP highlighted by red, and you may find out the result is quite good. And every 1 RMB loan added cannot bring so high GDP contribution, which means that the credit expansion contribution to the GDP is not so strong. And therefore, if we keep emphasizing the expansion of the credit, the result is not so ideal. And what should we consider or think? And let's look at the overissuing of the money behind the credit expansion. And I hope that how could we often talked about what is the reason, because it's not all the reasons I can explain, but I want to pick up some of the empty running of the financial system, because most of the money or the capital flow into China. And the people believe that it's good to have so much money. It's good, we welcome so much money inflow. But the higher inflow of money, which means do you have a more currency available in the market, no matter silver, gold, or US dollars, the result or the implication to the market is the same. Why China has such a roaring up of the foreign reserve? Let's look at this slide. This is the real exchange rate of the US dollars. And ever since 1994, reform proposed by Premier Zhu Rongji and also RMB pegged the US dollars closely. And after that, within less than 1 year, a little bit higher, lower than 1 year, and the USA appreciated. It is good news to RMB because RMB should gain more value because we have a higher production or productivity level, which means that RMB should gain more value gradually. And we pegged to a currency which is also gaining more value. It is a good match. But in 2020, this is from 2002, depreciation of US dollars, and we depeg RMB from the USA. And when USA depreciate and RMB gains more value, we can enjoy very good livelihood now. But we don't want to change such a policy because the policy is so good. With this policy, and we don't see such a chaos of controlling or managing it. And we really turn such a active way into passive way of management. It has its own benefits. When it's opened up in 2005, which was quite late, we made a commitment that we need to have stably and slowly appreciation or value higher for RMB. You know, RMB and RMB assets has become assets for hedge for the financial market because the RMB is gaining more value with appreciation expectation. You know, China's financing cost is very high. There is an interest spread plus the appreciating RMB. This is a double hedge by interest rate, hedge by the appreciating currency of RMB. And that's why a lot of money go into the Chinese market. Let's look at the foreign reserve of China. Once there is a money coming to China, we have a compulsory transaction of the foreign reserve. They become the foreign reserve of the central bank from 2002. 200 billion to 4 trillion, and you know it's very freezing at a high altitude. And what is the implication of so much influx of capital? And if we look at the history, and people believe that the US dollars influx should be a good news because every local government wants to have more investment, and you have money, you can develop yourself. But such a large influx of money, what are the implications? I want to give you a simple economic consideration. And in the Qing dynasty, it is and there is an influx of the silver because there is a trade between between European and China is in surplus. Therefore, and in Qianlong time, and we see a rising price. First of all, the European countries purchased a large quantity of Chinese goods, but China did not need European commodities. Why? And we don't know why. And you can find out the reasons in the history. And therefore, there is a trade surplus between China and Europe. The European countries have to pay by silver. And finally, the silver moved into China. Of course, they were digged out in US and shipped to Europe and then paid to China. And the European people did so because of hedging, because the silver value in China was higher than that of gold. So you can see this is a way of hedging. Digged out from US, shipped to Europe, and paid it to China. At the beginning, it was good. China's population was growing, and we need silver. But once the population growth was stabilized, we don't need so much silver. The influx of silver is more than 3 times of the silver produced by China, and China's self-supplied silver was not adequate. We do need to introduce more silver from other countries, but 3 times influx of silver needed by us is too much. Let's look at the result. It was the rise price of a Suzhou during Qianlong time. And you may see the rising price for the rice, for the silk, and what others? It is the luxury products. If we have a multi-wine, and I believe that's the rising of such a cost. And the ginsen's price was also rising quickly. And what worried most is not that the products, but the land. When people know, in case of inflation, what the Chinese people thought about how to maintain the value after purchasing the asset. If you can't buy it, you just grab it, or you just take it over from others. And here I give you several promises with a large agricultural output with a huge population base. Therefore, the value of the lands was going up quickly. After the land value went up, the rent for the land was also growing. Of course, it pushed up the rice price, the food price. And after the rice or the food price went up, the empress became worried. He wished to stabilize the country, who want to drive down the food cost. And what is the result? The urban population felt very happy, but the farmers were very starved. Therefore, by the end of Qianlong time, there was a very strong conflict in the society caused by the influx of the silver. People say it was good. You have so much silver. But as a matter of fact, behind such a story, the result was not very good at telling this Chinese history and economics. And let's look at the current similar result we face now. Recently, we heard how to allocate the foreign reserve, but that was not important. There are too much foreign reserve. How could we curb such a rise of the foreign reserve? This is highly important for us. Therefore, the foreign capital influx and outflow of the capital are strictly controlled. It was good because we want to stabilize our currency, and the result is quite good. We know where it comes from. Let's look at the structural reform at the supply side. Let's look at Japan first. Japan has a self-adjustment because in the early 1990s and after the economic bubble crashed, the Central Bank of Japan adopted regular and non-regular monetary policy, which were not good enough. Therefore, Japan have 20 years of deflation, which worried by most of the economists. You know that lower price that I don't buy today, I buy it tomorrow. The other thing is that the lower price drop is faster than the company's cost driving up. Therefore, they become a debt owner. And you can see it is a wealth. The wealth shift between the debt owner and the wealth owner. And with this background, you can imagine. And the government feel highly worried because the Japanese government borrowed a lot of debt at a very high level of debt. And the Japanese government can never return or can never pay back their debt. Therefore, government of MB wants to use the macro stimulus plan to turn inflationary status of Japanese economy to a 2% inflation. However, it takes so many years. But the result has not been fulfilled. The Chinese people have the concern of inflationary level. It's so difficult to push up the commodity price in Japan. It's so difficult. But it is fine that 20 years deflation, what does it mean? In the past, we look at this deflationary from a macroeconomic view. We should stop doing so, and we want to look at it from the micro perspective of economy. Maybe Deflation is a way to save economy itself. It is called a self-regulation or self-regulating, self-remediating market. Deflation, lowering price, yes, indicators how this process is going on. If we look at the CPI of Japan, is lower than 100, which means it is deflation. It is in deflation, and MB government pushed it up in recent months, but still not yet 2% inflationary. This is the land price variation of Japan, and then the bubble crashes, and the land value went down gradually. Therefore, the land cost and the value were maintained at a very low level, and most of the land in Japan is not comparable to that in Beijing or Shanghai. Let's look at the unit labor cost, which means the unit labor cost, which is on the rise at the beginning of the crash, it goes down. Therefore, the labor cost goes down. Let's look at the USA, whose labor cost keeps growing. Therefore, what you see in Japan is quite simple. All kinds of production material are dropping. What is the result nowadays? And after so long dropping, the Japan's export to China in April 2014, it was 13% growth rate, which is rare in history. Why there was a fast exportation of Japan to China was growing so quickly? Because it was cheap. When the Chinese people travel in Japan, they find that it's good. Well, you can buy anything you want. You can afford it. And you can see Japan's. So it's kind of a self-regulating, self-adjusting, and Japan didn't do what we call supplier-side reform, and they leave it alone for its own self-adjusting. So the result apparently is good, though very long, very struggling. What makes it very struggling? Just like you cut the tail of the cats, you cut every bit of the tail every day for 20 years. I don't know if a cat can live up to 20 years. So this is really a painful process. However, if you go through it, and you can basically fulfill your task. If we look at China's supply side reform, if we want to avoid the so-called 25 years painful days, we need to take a more aggressive instead of a self-adjusting and passive adjustment. And we should do something in the policy side. Just now I mentioned we lower the cost. That's why we have such a concern here.
And for the overcapacity, and we are seeing actually the increase of the cost, so that may have a negative impact of the economy. And so when we are actually doing this kind of a curtailment of an overcapacity, and we really need to simulate this market role and this market function, and we really need to think from the market perspective and to consider which kind of capacity and we need to cut, and also which kind of capacity we need to retain. And if after we cut the overcapacity, and we are seeing the higher costs, so that means and we are already seeing the negative impact. And also on the other hand, we are seeing that China is still a mid-income country, and there was still a lot of weakness as well as the potentials of further development. So by taking a more proactive approach, we want to make up our weakness. And for example, one of the heated sector is education, and we do have a very scarce education resources. So we probably, in terms of the policy making, may allow the emergence of for-profit education, and we also encourage the innovation as well as the entrepreneurship, but that needs long-term effort. Last but not least, we also need to refuse this kind of an arbitrage model. And in the past, we allowed the influx of the foreign capitals to do the arbitrage, and that's cost that 10% 10% of the ROE is a low number, and we want to see 40% or even 50%. However, in the future, we believe that if we can reach to 10 or 8%, that is also a very good idea. And our ultimate target is to realize floating RMB, and nowadays we do not really have a good condition because most of our fixed asset investments is still lie in the real estate sector. And if we just give freedom to the RMB fluctuations, and people may thinking that they may sell their property and then changing it to USD. So it is a very long-term goal. And if we can realize there's a long-term goal, we believe that in the next 10 years, economic growth can also be maintained at 6% or even higher. And in terms of the improvement of the people's life and living standards, we are going to see a very big breakthrough because for then 10% of the growth rate for 10 years means they doubled the economy. And however, we do need to consider the precondition, which is a huge effort on the supply side. So this is my presentation. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Li. So now we are going to start our dialogue. So let's welcome Professor Li Wei and the Chief Asian Economist of Bloomberg, Tom Olink.
So, I expect many of you are quite disappointed to see me coming back to moderate the second session. Why can't there be a different moderator? So in an effort to mix things up and keep some variety, you'll see I'm sitting on the other side this time. So Professor Li, fascinating presentation, so much to talk about on the big picture stuff. But before we get there, let's talk a little bit about your survey, a survey of some of the most dynamic entrepreneurs in the Chinese economy, graduates of the Cheung Kong Graduate School of Business. And when I look at the results, I mean, it's really striking the divergence between how these entrepreneurs see the state of the economy and the opportunities and how pretty much the rest of the economy thinks about things, right? When I look at the investment and the recruitment indexes in your survey, these entrepreneurs are investing and hiring at a phenomenal pace. And as we saw from Professor Gan's survey, if we look at the broader industrial and manufacturing sector, that's just not happening. So talk us through what's driving this. Why are this small set of entrepreneurs, why are they seeing the Chinese economic opportunity in such a different way?
In a way, that's what you exactly want to happen, right? Even when the average firm is not investing, you want the best firms keep on investing, right? Because these are the firms who will grow and replace firms that are not growing or are shrinking, right? So their capacity, there's going to be a shift of capacity from less productive firms to productive firms. And so this is, if we, just like in Japan, if you simply let the market take care of itself, it will. It just takes so long, and it's so painful. And that's, we see that in the data already. So in a way, we always say, trust the market. The market actually is actually doing its job. There's also another side to this. That side is related to the issue of transition. So many of our firms also realize that their old capacity, their old industry that they are in is not growing, and they need to move. They either need to move into another area with the same industry and same production, or they need to move into a whole new different industry. So they need to change the way they make money, and we see this in the in our data. Since I'm teaching in CKGSB, I also see how our students sort of change themselves. They used to be. So when I first came to CKGSB 2005, when I was teaching, I realized there's a significant percentage of our students are export oriented firms, and today you would be very rare to find a few of them among our students, and so it doesn't mean that these people are not in here. And they changed, right? They decided to move away from export-oriented industries into other industries, services, and particularly into finance. And by finance, I mean sort of shadow banking, right? So there's a large increase in shadow banking activities and shadow banking-related firms in the last 10 years. Since the large inflow of foreign exchange into China that fueled this, the need for so where do you deploy all this inflow of capital, and how do you do it? And so these new firms are very very active, and they make a good portion of our students today, although we try to limit their numbers.
Let's talk about shadow banking for a moment. The name shadow banking, it immediately sounds negative, right? The reality, of course, is that a part of this is high-risk activity, arbitraging the regulatory system, but a part of it is actually very positive. The whole Wenzhou entrepreneurial success story is a story about shadow banking, channeling funds to private sector, dynamic private sector firms, exporters in the case of Wenzhou. Now, on Friday, the People's Bank of China, late on Friday evening, as part of an ongoing People's Bank of China campaign to ruin my Friday evenings and weekends, published a very long set of regulatory proposals on the shadow banking sector, a sweeping crackdown on some of the riskiest parts of the sector. How should we interpret this? How do you think that's going to play out?
I totally agree with you, and from an economist perspective, shadow banking should not be eliminated. There are economic reasons why they exist, right? And they are, I think, in the future, they will continue to be an integral part of the Chinese financial system. But having said that, and when we take a look at the rise of shadow banking in China, you realize that has to do with the fact that the large inflow of foreign exchange caused a huge increase in foreign exchange reserves, which the central bank has to hold. And so if you think about this, if the people who are bringing money into China to arbitrage, they need a counterparty to hold the money. And if they are making money, the counterparty must be losing money, right? So who is the counterparty? And it turns out to be the Chinese central bank. So the Chinese central bank holding all this foreign exchange, they invested mostly in American treasuries and European treasuries, Japanese, treasuries. They're not earning much, but so they are holding it, and that means when they buy these foreign exchange, they have to create new money. And when they create too much new money, then there's oversupplying money, right? So then you expect high inflation and so on and so forth. So in order to disinfect this inflow, and the central bank in China actually issue bonds, Yangpiao. And even when you issue bonds, this is kind of weird, right? Because if you think about this, central bank is an institution that can print money. Why do you need to borrow money? And so when a central bank, when an institution that can print money and is also borrowing money at the same time, then you know something is amiss, right? So, and in fact, that's exactly an indication of the central bank is the counterparty, because issuing bonds in China is more expensive. So the central bank would pay a 4 or 5% interest rate, a 3 to 4% interest rate. And when they invest in U.S. Treasury, they earn 1%. So they are, in fact, the counterparty to the arbitrageurs. And the central bank obviously can't play that role forever, right? Because if you do that role forever, then eventually you will show a loss on their income statement, and then the Chinese Ministry of Finance would have to subsidize them. And that's sort of unheard of, right? You can print money, why you need to be subsidized? And so in the end, the central bank decided that why don't we push the cost down to banking system? And how do we do that? And so we know the broad money, the M2, is basically a product of money multiplier and the base money, right? The base money, you think about this in China, is basically the foreign exchange, right? And sort of the money newly created to buy the foreign exchange. And the money multiplier then is important. So if the money multiplier is very high, then the broad money is too much. So the way to control the growth of broad money is then to raise the banking sector's required reserve ratio. And when you raise the required reserve ratio, the bank then said, well, now if I take all this deposit to put on my balance sheet, it's expensive, right? And so I have an incentive to actually putting some of my banking activities outside my balance sheet to evade this regulation for a high required reserve ratio. And then in China, it actually reached to 21.5%. That's last time I checked. That's the highest I've ever seen in human history.
So historically, that was the pattern, right?
Right.
That was the pattern from 2005 through to 2014, where we had steady yuan appreciation and steady accumulation of China's foreign exchange reserves. And the PBOC what that meant was the PBOC was flooding the financial system with liquidity, and that's why we saw these complex maneuvers you described, and ultimately the birth of this very risky shadow banking sector. Now, as you know, in the last 2 years, that situation has kind of swung into reverse, right? We've gone from yuan appreciation expectations to yuan depreciation expectations, maybe something closer to balance now. Foreign exchange reserves went from growing to shrinking. Now they're stable. So the dynamic you described has changed. Does that mean that the risk levels in China's financial sector are going to start coming down of their own accord? Does the shift in the exchange rate and the FX reserves and the PBOC injections solve the problem of excess leverage and a risky shadow banking sector? Or do we need to see a big substantial shift in policy as well?
Right. So this is a very good question. And so long as there are differential regulations for on-the-balance sheet activities and off-the-balance sheet activities, and there's always going to be what we call the regulatory arbitrage reasons for the existence of shadow banking, right? And that still exists today. And that's one of the reasons why if you as a regulator, one thing you want to do is you want to level the playing field, right? So basically you want to say, okay, if on the balance sheet you face all these regulations, then maybe we should also put equal amount of regulation pressure, costs on the off the balance sheet activity, which is the shadow banking activities. That's what you see. And the idea is that you do not want to create a situation where the shadow banking siphons out the resources from the formal banking system more and more, because the regulation of on the banks are going to increase in the future rather than decrease, right? So that's one of the things you can see, that this is rebalancing on these two. And so most part, I think it's positive, but the effect does have negative sort of impact on real economy, as we are already seeing the rising interest rate, the liquidity is also falling, right, in the marketplace. So it does have impact on the real economy, and hopefully that as the regulation settles down, the new equilibrium would be reached, and then there would be a more healthy balance between formal banking and shadow banking. And I don't think it's a good idea to eliminate all shadow banking, because they exist to serve the people who are not served by the formal banking system.
How about that 融资难,融资贵问题? The finance is difficult, finance is expensive. Professor Gan's survey seems to suggest actually it's not a big problem. The issue is not lack of finance. The issue is that firms don't want to invest. For your guys, for the entrepreneurs in your survey, what's the financing environment like? Can they tap the capital they need to grow their businesses? And are there concerns that as the deleveraging campaign progresses, perhaps life on the financing for those kind of firms could become more difficult?
For our firm, finance remains an issue, right? As you can see from our data, so the data for the financial conditions, financing conditions, is significantly below 50, right? So for them, it's still an issue, and I think that has to do with the fact that some of our firms they need capital, but they don't have lots of fixed asset as collateral, right? So and then in the Chinese system requires that, and the other thing is that many of our firms are small and they are privately owned, so they cannot, when they compete for funds against larger firms, and they are at disadvantage because larger firms can reach a size where even though nationally they are not too big to fail, but regionally they may be too big to fail. So the regional government may actually rescue them, and so as a banking officer, they are making loans, and you obviously prefer firms where there are implicit local government or regional government guarantee versus firms that don't have it. So one of the important reform, I think, you are mentioning, is in fact to stop this regional too big to fail, right?
One of the key points which came through from your presentation was this point about costs, right?
Right.
The costs are too high. We have to bring costs down. That's a critical part of driving a more dynamic entrepreneurial business sector. At the same time, costs for one firm are profits for others, or higher wages supporting consumption. I think what we've seen in the last year is basically a kind of a shift in profitability towards the upstream end of the supply chain, right? So because steel firms and coal firms have got so much debt, the government has almost deliberately ramped up prices in those sectors to create a surge in profits to help them pay down their debts. At the same time, clearly higher costs for steel creates higher costs for everyone using steel down the supply chain, whether that be auto firms, home appliance makers, or whoever. How do you balance that? When you say costs have to come down, who do costs have to come down for?
Yeah. So when we look at the costs, it boils down to basically cost of production, right? The cost of production have several components. One is labor. Labor cost has risen substantially, and we think rising labor costs is mostly highly positive. And that's the reason for economic development, right? I mean, what's the point of economic development if the wages are stagnant? So rising wages are in China mostly positive, and it's also related to 2005's reform where the government eliminated agricultural tax. So when you eliminate agricultural tax, for many of these the rural laborers, their opportunity cost for coming into the city and to do factory work has risen, right? So the factory better pay them higher wage, otherwise they can stay in the countryside. And so that's a very positive move, and that really raised the wages of the lowest skilled workers in China, and I think it's a highly positive thing. So I'm not complaining about labor costs. I think labor costs are generally positive. And then once you put the labor cost aside and you look at what other costs there are, and a significant portion of the cost of doing business is in fact floor space, right? We're doing this conference here. This is very luxurious, even though the floor doesn't look very nice, but it's not 5-star hotel style, but boy, but the dirt, I'm sorry, not dirt, the concrete here is so expensive. And so how we think about this, right? When we're doing our business here, we're doing an education institution here and renting a very expensive office. So that's very part of it. And these costs are rising very significantly. And you might ask why, but the why is important, right? Because the land prices in China has risen substantially. And lowering those land prices is not easy, right? And you keep going up. And as your mother-in-law has already told you, so right. So it's a very important thing, and it's not going to come down. And we don't foresee that the policy changes that will significantly reduce land costs. And the other one then left is financing costs, right? Financing costs in China is high because if you think about this, right, Chinese economy has the highest savings rate among all large economies. There are some countries that has higher savings rate than China, but they are small countries. They're like Singapore, and a third-tier city would just replace them. And for China to have so much saving, and yet the financing cost is so high, it's a mystery, right? And so there is so much supply of funds, and you would imagine that Chinese firms should enjoy, and Chinese firm and government should enjoy lower cost of financing. But we look at Europe says, boy, you guys can issue debt at negative interest rate. How nice! But that's we don't see that in China. Not today, not in 10 years. Okay.
I think you make a very interesting point about real estate, and I think it's a point which isn't made often enough, which is the real estate story. It's not just about real estate developers and property speculators, right? It's about the cost of doing business across the entire economy. House prices go up, office prices go up, industrial space price goes up, the cost of doing business goes up. We've got a few more minutes. I want to try and take advantage of that to hit you with questions on two areas, the Party Congress and what follows, and your outlook for what we should look for in 2018. Let's start with the Party Congress. So my view going into the Party Congress was economic policy after the Party Congress would be pretty much business as usual. The trajectory was already set by the 13th five-year plan, by the Financial Work Conference. We weren't going to see a big bang in terms of policy shifts. I'm starting to think that maybe I was wrong. We saw that big announcement on opening the financial sector, lifting the cap on foreign ownership of banks and security firms and asset managers. Then we saw the PBOC's big announcement on regulating the asset management sector. What's your interpretation? Do you think we're seeing not a change in trajectory in terms of reform, but a big acceleration in terms of the pace of reform after the Party Congress?
you know, when we look at the financial sector reform in particular, with the promise to open up the financial sector to foreign competition, and that's a really positive aspect, right? And if you think about this, China made a promise to do so after joining WTO, but hasn't sort of not fully fulfilled that promise. And so this is really a full step towards that goal, and that's really a positive step, because that just suggests to us that the Chinese government and the party realize that a more rigorous and competitive banking sector will help probably lower the financing costs in China, right? And so if you think about what area that's easiest to tackle, it is the financing costs, right? Because we can't easily make the land price fall, and that's involved too many aspects of the Chinese economy, affecting so many middle class in China, in particular in Beijing and Shanghai. And so that is a key issue. But if we can do reforms that will lower the financing costs across board, and make the financial sector more risk sort of tolerant, and that would be a gain for the Chinese economy overall. And as I mentioned, there's three things, right? Labor costs, we will probably should keep rising, and land price hopefully sort of capped, and financing costs, if they can bring down, and I think we'll see more growth in China.
Let's end by throwing it forwards and thinking about 2018. A huge number of different variables to think about. Changes in the heads of some of the main central banks around the world. The government here in China promising both to stick to strong growth, but also to progress deleveraging. The Fed beginning its balance sheet unwind. How are all of these factors going to come together? What are the sort of key risks and opportunities that you're thinking about and you're teaching your class about looking into 2018?
Right. And when we look at the changes in the Fed and other central banks, so far we don't see a lot of substantive changes in the policy orientation. Of course, we worry that if the Fed starts shrinking or its balance sheet at a faster rate than we anticipate, and raising interest rate at a faster pace than we anticipate, and that would have a larger impact on China as an emerging market, because we are so dependent on the international price signals. And when the Fed raised interest rate at a rate faster than we anticipate, the Chinese central bank will probably have to simultaneously raise the Chinese interest rate. And that might not be a good thing for China at the moment. And so as a more dovish view of the Fed is definitely a positive, more positive than China, than a more hawkish stance in the U.S. and other countries, including Japan and Europe. But going forward, we sort of, at least in 2018, we don't see that. And that's where we're surprised. So given that, I think the next year is going to be more or less similar to this year, but probably with a higher growth rate, and hopefully that financial sector reforms are going to bring in real benefits in the long run. In the short run, I think there are more pain, but hopefully in the long run, there will be more benefits.
So at the start of today's session, we heard a fascinating presentation from the Dean, where he spoke about many things, but one of them was artificial intelligence, and the way in which artificial intelligence is going to reshape labor markets. And he mentioned a swathe of different professions that were going to be downsized as a result of artificial intelligence. He didn't mention market economists, But I think that was just because he was being polite, because he saw me sitting in the front row. Let me ask you a final question. Based on your survey, based on your teaching, based on what you see in your class, which profession should I be going into after I'm replaced as an economist by one of the new machines?
Well, let me say this. Don't be an accountant.
Okay.
And our dean happened to be trained as an accountant, accounting professor. But anyway, but I think there are some sectors, right? I think some professions will see the demand falling significantly, where the artificial intelligence can play a very significant role. But I think more of the abstract things and the things that relates to sort of relating to people, right? And those roles are going to be important. For example, I do see some sort of scales, some sort of teaching will be replaced by robots. You know, in the future we might, learning how to drive cars, how to fly planes. Sitting in a really nice, nice simulator would be, much easier than today's technology. But other than that, I think we see a huge potential, but I don't think being an economist we should be worried.
Okay. Well, I'm going to continue hedging my bets by combining my spreadsheet analysis with more mother-in-law jokes in future presentations. With that, I think we're running short of time, so let me thank Professor Li for his fantastic insights. And say once again that for Professor Li's data, Professor Gan's data, and all of the market and economic data, you need to understand the Chinese economy. Bloomberg has made it our business to make sure all of that is available on the Bloomberg terminal. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you.
非常感谢李伟教授。
Thank you, Professor Li Wei. Thank you, our Tom Oleg, who sits both sides, or left and right. Thank you very much. Now we are going to have a coffee break. We have 15 minutes for the coffee break, and you can enjoy the refreshment outside. And please be noted that we will continue our second session after 15 minutes. We have many good and excellent experts such as Professor Xu Chenggang, who was the first recipient of China Economics Prize. And now it is 4:20. Let's come back at 4:35. Thank you.